uh, We have just shy of 70 people aboard with us. We expect to about double that number before we're all said and done, but people will join along the way. Welcome, everyone. My name is David Birdsell. I'm Dean of the Austin W. Marks School of Public and International Affairs, and I am delighted to be convening this conversation today with a panel of 8 distinguished voices, experts in various areas of policy and public administration, to talk about what we can expect of a new Biden administration. We're going to try to move this quickly. There are, of course, far more topics available to talk about than we have time to discuss, but we also want to be able to hear what's on your mind and what you'd like to hear us talk about as we explore the 4 major areas that the Biden administration has said they want to attack in the first 100 days. And those are, of course, first and foremost, dealing with the pandemic, both the healthcare issues directly and the economic consequences and other consequences of the pandemic. Number 2, reestablishing our relations in the world with our allies and others. Number 3, infrastructure. And number 4, dealing with social equity in a convincing and compelling way with regard to all of those policies and the specific policies that they comprehend. And of course, when we talk about those big basket items that the administration, the incoming administration has flagged, there's a host of policies from migration to education to climate change to trade agreements to everything else. And those are the things we're going to be looking at as we try to tuck them up into those various policy arenas. Joining me today are colleagues from across Baruch College, many of them in the Marks School of Public and International Affairs, and I'm going to introduce them in the order that they appear on my bezel, which, as you know, changes from time to time, so this may not be the order in which you see them. But we're pleased to have our colleague from political scientist, David Lindsey. He is a political scientist who specializes in international affairs and diplomacy and has written a series of articles very recently on the Middle East. Mitchell Wallerstein is a university professor and former president of Baruch College. He specializes in climate change and in defense policy, and will be dealing with both of those issues this afternoon. Next to Mitch, again on my bezel, is Professor Carla Robbins, who is the faculty director of the Master of International Affairs program at the Marks School. She is a distinguished journalist with 2 Pulitzer Prizes to her credit, also focusing on defense policy and on international trade agreements and other aspects of diplomacy. Carla is also a senior adjunct fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Professor Desmond Arias is a professor of Western Hemisphere Affairs in the Marks School, the Marks Professor of Western Hemisphere Affairs in the Marks School, with particular interests in non-governmental responses to governance, whether it's in areas of illegal activity, rebel-controlled territories, and other issues relating both to law enforcement and governance throughout the hemisphere and beyond. Professor Robert Courtney Smith is a sociologist specializing in migration, and Rob has done tremendous work not only to build the scholarly literature in this arena, but also as a direct participant via amicus briefs and other community building organizations as he has prosecuted his work on migration, particularly from Mexico, but not exclusively with, for that country. Professor Hector Cordero Guzman is a sociologist and a demographer who has a keen interest in workforce, in equity issues, in migration, and in a broad set of issues that relate to some of his many board service placements in New York and in the nation. He also serves as the director of the Samuels Center for New York State and New York City policy here in the Marks School. Professor and Associate Dean Patria de Lancer-Julnes is the Associate Dean in the Marks School. She is a distinguished public administration scholar and the incoming president of the American Society for Public Administration. Congratulations, Patria. The ink isn't dry on that election yet, and we're very proud to have you in that role. And I hope that Patria will be talking to us to a certain extent about the shape of the federal workforce in the new administration, which has suffered such brickbats and arrows over the course of these these last 4 years and more, but we'll talk about what it might look like in the Biden administration. And last but not least, we're very pleased to have with us Professor Mike Messiah. In addition to his work teaching in the executive MPA program at Baruch and as well at John Jay College, Mike, in his day job, is the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer at the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, a position that he originated at the request of Chairman Rick Cotton, and that he has used to create equity across a broad spectrum of activity, not only involving MWBE contracting, but direct equity investments using the vast power of the authority across the length and breadth of his activities. And Mike has served in, I think it's fair to say, Mike, every single senior administration except chairman at the Port Authority, and so knows more than anybody I know about the way that the infrastructure programs of the new administration are likely to roll out. So welcome everybody, and thank you for spending your time here today. For members of the audience, you can always post questions in chat, and I will try to elevate those as best I'm able during the conversation. We'll talk for about 45, 50 minutes among ourselves, and then we'll get out to your questions and try to answer as many of them as possible within the time that we have right up till 2:30 this afternoon. So let's get right to it. And I'm going to start with a broad question that I would we're going to start in the coronavirus area, but I'd like to move very quickly through coronavirus because we've all been watching this closely, and some of us have been trying to get ourselves in front of needles and vaccinated now that those vaccines are present. What do you expect to be the differences in a Biden administration approach to the pandemic from what we've seen in the last year of the Trump administration's management of this disease? Carl, I see you're unmuted. Let me turn to you first.
On the coronavirus?
Yeah.
Well, one hopes they're going to be a lot more competent and a lot more organized. First of all, they're not in denial, which is just a really fundamental thing. And you even see it from the symbolism of what's happening today. They're beginning their roll into the inauguration with a variety of actions that, look at the incredible, solemnity and the tragedy of the losses. I mean, that's what they're saying here. There's no triumphalism here. They're talking about this as a national tragedy and a moment of unity. But they also have an enormous challenge in front of them. I mean, he's made a very, very big commitment, 100 million shots in 100 days. We'll see if he can do it. And it's made even more challenging by the fact that the Trump administration refused to give them the information, refused to give them access to the computer system. So they have a big challenge in front of them, but, they're working with facts and they're working with a huge amount of commitment. They're competent people who've had the experience before, and God willing, they'll be able to do it. But this is an enormous challenge, and it is the number one commitment, and it's the number one thing about which they will be judged both domestically and internationally. Because I would say, for all of the terrible things that Trump did globally, I think the most enormous hit to our reputation was the fact that we look incompetent.
And not just in terms of pandemic response, right? And we can talk about that as we move through today's conversation. So indeed, 100 million shots and actually, if we talk about full vaccinations, presumably that's closer to 200 million if we talk about second doses, but it's unclear to me exactly how they're defining that. Is everybody reasonably confident that there is a plan in place to make that happen and the coordination necessary with the private sector to pull off that level of coordination? Patria, you're nodding your head, so I'll let you take that one.
Well, I mean, I'm not going to say that it's going to happen overnight, but I was very pleased to see that there's going to be a focus on strengthening public health and then basically trying to get out there a whole court of public health people that are going to be able to give these vaccines. I myself actually think that they need to be going to institutions like schools, for example, and that's where they need to set shop in a number of places, including schools, college campuses, and everywhere, and try to develop a tracking system that is a bit more sophisticated than what we're using right now, and to be able to deploy this really fast. But I'm fairly confident that there's going to be also a better plan, and that the fact that they are deploying better information to people, less conflicting information. There's going to be a mandate to use masks, for example, in federal buildings. And I hope that that is also going to inspire many more state governments to really implement those mandates and to force the mandates, because clearly masks work. Otherwise, doctors would not use them. So I feel positive. I feel optimistic. I'm not that cautiously optimistic. I'm optimistic.
Terrific. Mitch.
Yeah, just very briefly, I think the problem right now is as much logistical as anything else. We have never attempted to do a mass vaccination program on this scale, perhaps since the polio epidemic in the 1950s. And the challenge of reaching every state, including rural areas, with the vaccine is enormous. I'm located right now in a state in the Rocky Mountains, and there's just no supply here. There's no availability. And of course, the revelation in the last week that the administration basically lied, and that's the right word, lied about the availability of reserves is simply outrageous.
Well, one of the things that we've seen cascading through state governments across the United States is the promise of additional doses available that are not made available at the end of the day, including in New York State. And you're speaking, your humble interlocutor here is one of those people who was on the Mount Sinai list, who got summarily turfed off the Mount Sinai list on Thursday evening. So I speak from the point of I feel your pain, but not your needle stick. So we'll try for both in the coming days. Let me just stay briefly on this issue of competence in government. This is something that we've all been paying close attention to. And I'd actually like to go to Mike Messiah here, if I could. Mike, you have a position in which you relate to state governments on both sides of the Hudson. You have significant federal involvement with the Department of Transportation. Just in terms of the smooth operations of government, what changes do you expect to see unfolding over the course of the next 100 days and beyond?
Well, there's a spirit of cooperativeness and collaboration. If you listen to the Governor Cuomo's State of the State, Governor Murphy a couple of weeks ago, the mayors, they all see infrastructure as a vital means of increasing the economic activity and jobs, as well as achieving their green objectives. So there's a commonality. There's a vision. All of them speak to zero emissions in whatever we build, and green technology. They all speak to infusing global best practices regarding technology into the infrastructure. They all talk about a consciousness about racial equity. They all talk about good paying jobs, prevailing wages, union jobs. They speak about including small businesses in the delivery of these programs. So I'm really excited about the unity in that regard. They recognize the need for community engagement as we roll out infrastructure projects. I use the LaGuardia Terminal B experience as an example. For example, $1.5 billion went to MWBEs so far regarding Terminal B in the Delta build out. That's an intentional objective of the state, the local government, and the Port Authority, all working in unison to realize such goals. So I'm really optimistic about the vision is a shared one regarding at least infrastructure. And there's examples of how cooperation and good governance can get it done. LaGuardia came in on budget and on time. And it was done during COVID to some degree. So kudos to all the partners in that regard.
Like you're drawing a connection. I think many of us are very excited here because we believe politically that, and I'd be interested if anybody disagrees with this assessment, politically that infrastructure may be the thing that's most likely to get beyond COVID-19 majorities on both sides of the aisle in Congress, that we have a real opportunity to make some investments here. There was the will, but not the way, apparently, during the course of the Trump administration. And you're making the case that this is fundamentally both a green and an equity investment if properly conceived, although most people don't always think equity when they think infrastructure. Beyond MWBE participation in the contracting process, and of course, for those of you unfamiliar with the acronym, we're talking about minority and women-owned business enterprises. What are the equity implications of infrastructure, and why is that such an important play for leveling the playing field across the region, but really across the nation as well? Mike, that's to you. You're on
Yeah,
mute.
okay, yes. Jobs, good paying jobs, the trades, service jobs that come after the infrastructure is built. A lot of the contracts talk about union harmony. They talk about prevailing wages. Even if we make waivers for some of the smaller minority-owned businesses in that regard, they still have to pay prevailing wages if they're on the project, and be consistent in terms of the benefits that are appropriate to pay their staff. In addition, all of the agencies have capacity building programs that are linked to these major initiatives. We help build the capacity of businesses. We do a lot of education around careers. We join with a group like the Council for Airport Opportunity, who is the throughput for jobs that are associated with the airports. So baked in, and one other thing, we have very strong community engagement. We have councils that we meet with regularly to make sure we're in tune with the specific needs of the community. And I think all of that speaks to equity and ensuring that our planning is aligned with the needs of the community as we build these projects. We recognize we need to be good neighbors when we do infrastructure.
And if I may add, David, I definitely agree with Michael because, especially for years, even during the Obama administration, there were a lot of projects, they didn't get made. Infrastructure hasn't really received a lot of money during the Trump administration. He said he was going to do, didn't happen. I think that the coronavirus, again, the way I see it, the coronavirus is at the very top of the apex. So everything you can connect it to it. And so if you talk about it as what we have right now, a national crisis, that can definitely help to accelerate this investment in infrastructure, the investment in jobs. It helps to address the dual pandemic that we have, which is basically a lot of minority people of color not losing their jobs and not having the kind of resources that they need. But this infrastructure is going to be key to start to ameliorate those problems. So I agree with Michael, and I think it's a great opportunity for the Biden administration to put it in concert with the crisis package that he's put together and really go forward with it, because it will have that's the one area where there's going to be, I think, agreement between the two parties.
Infrastructure,
yes.
right. Mitch.
Yeah, my fear, clearly infrastructure is desperately needed. We've had, how many times have we had Infrastructure Week in the past 4 years?
13.
My fear, however, is that the Republicans are going to retreat into their traditional pose as deficit hawks. And a number of commentators have been commenting on this. So that could affect both Biden's very ambitious COVID plan, but also it could affect investment in infrastructure, which just would be incredibly short-sighted. So we'll see soon how reflexive they want to be.
Time will tell on that one. Hector, let me come to you on workforce, since we've really teed up workforce and the equity adjacencies with workforce. The Biden administration clearly has infrastructure planning in this regard. They're also talking about raising the minimum wage nationally to $15 an hour. Where do you see this going, and what are the big political speed bumps that you think it will be hard to hurdle? You're on mute.
Definitely a lot of what Mike brought up in terms of the change in attitude and approach needed around local community development investments and infrastructure investments, move straight into the labor side. We've had Alexander Acosta, a former NLRB appointee on the conservative side, always defending kind of employer interests versus labor interest on that side, and also famed with this connection with the Epstein case, and then followed by Eugene Scalia, who didn't think OSHA had any role in the COVID crisis, for heaven's sake, occupational safety and health, and who did everything he could to weaken overtime rules, tip rules for restaurant and other tip workers, to weaken requirements for paid sick leave, and to expand and allow for more independent contractor, so-called, to be hired, so that employers didn't really have to hire as employees and provide full benefits to workers. So we know you can destroy something very quickly, but it takes a while to build. So I think we should be thoughtful and engage in some kind of major change, but not expect too much to happen too quickly. But we definitely are going to see, at least in the Department of Labor, a change in attitude. Marty Walsh, the appointed labor secretary, is actually a labor leader in the trades, thinking about infrastructure. And we haven't had an actual labor leader as labor secretary in some time. So we're hoping that that's going to have an impact, certainly on NLRB and labor relations, on labor rights issues, on occupational safety and health issues. And hopefully it'll spill over into education and training, which has been somewhat abandoned during the Trump era. Remember, he got into office advocating or arguing a lot for those workers that were left behind. It's painful to revive some of those arguments, but we all know what they were. They had to do around who took your factory and who took your job, and very xenophobic expressions of those two real concerns. I think there's a lot of hope with this administration that we can then refocus back on public and social policy that actually helps support those very low wage and other workers that have been affected by those trends, now added by the huge unemployment crisis created by COVID. So there's expectation that the Labor Department is going to be a busy place over the next 4 years, and there are certainly a number of areas, as I've kind of tried to briefly summarize, where we should expect to see some major activity. Occupational safety and health, I would expect to be leading, and rule changes around overtime pay and tip workers and paid sick leave are likely to happen very quickly. And finally, I think there's been a tradition of really strong chief economists at the Labor Department, Bill Spriggs, Heidi Schreitholz. So we're hoping for some strong appointments that would bring alignment between the work in infrastructure, economic development, and labor, and then would put forth models that show a different way to work with labor rights that truly lifts all boats.
Thank you for that. I want to go to two implications of what you've just said, Hector. One that I'd like to explore with Rob, and then the next with Carla. Rob, there is this sense of who took my jobs, and in some cases it's a matter of offshoring, and that's what I'm going to explore with Carla in just a moment. But in many other cases, there are concerns that the people who took my jobs are people who came to the United States, whether legally or otherwise. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the politics of migration as you see them in the new administration, with regard certainly to DACA and DAPA to follow on, but also H-1B and various worker visas. Where do you think those go during a period of economic recovery and the jobs expansion that we expect to see early and continuing in a Biden administration, or at least hope to see?
So, as always, I'm going to do the professor thing of answering the question in at least two parts, but I'll try to be, unlike most professors, concise. The first thing is, when you say the politics of immigration related to jobs in the economy, is the perception versus the reality. So the National Academies of Science in the United States have done studies showing there's not that much displacement of native workers. And in fact, overall, immigrants add a tremendous amount to the economy, and they're necessary for the economy to grow. Versus there's a very strong, I would say about 75 million people who actually believe that immigrants are taking jobs from everybody. And the places where those beliefs are the most strong are also the places that were hit worst by globalization, for example, right? Like the places where people lost jobs in factories to globalization and mechanization are in like the Midwest, in places that were very deep red countries. So I think no matter what the reality is, we're going to have a very big problem in terms of negotiating these issues. I think in terms of the overall immigration policies that the U.S. ought to be pursuing, there's several key agenda items that I think. One of them is we need to legalize a lot of people. We have 11 million undocumented people in the United States, which would make it the 12th largest country in Europe. We also have 5 million children, US citizen children, 4.5 million, who have an undocumented parent. That's bigger than Norway and bigger than Ireland. So we have a country-sized population of undocumented people and a country-sized population of children whose parents can be taken home because their parents get pulled out, can be deported because on the way home, somebody pulls them over and they get deported directly by ICE from the roadside. That's morally wrong. And I think it's a high priority for Biden. Another thing Biden has said is related to the economy. He is going to propose, I think I saw this, that essential workers get an immediate path to legalization. And I think that's really important because we've been relying on all of these agricultural workers, all the people that work in factories, right, who are doing all of the preparing the food that comes to our doors where we get to eat safely in our homes without going outside. That's super duper important. I think there's one or two other things. Should I add them now in 40 seconds, David, or should we come back?
Those 40 seconds are yours. Take it away.
So there's two or three other huge important issues, I think. One of them is we need a new approach on family reunification. The most egregious example of this is the 500 or 600 kids who were separated from their parents, babies who were nursing, and the Trump administration didn't even bother to write their names in an Excel spreadsheet to try to reunite them with their parents. That's morally wrong. And I don't see how anyone could do that and go to sleep at night. The second thing is, we now have a standard to stop deportation of grave and unusual hardship to a US citizen. So if I'm doing a deportation defense, if I find a kid with leukemia, it's great news because then we can stop the mother from being deported. If the kid's healthy and doing well in school, boom, the mother's gone. I don't see how that makes any sense or helps anybody. Another thing, we should end the Muslim ban and we should restore our refugee policy to conform with the values that we pushed and we promoted rightly when we helped to form the refugee regime after the disaster of the Holocaust. The historical echoes have been horrible, and pushing people into Mexico to wait or bringing them in, letting them come in, and then having them deported and then recycling them as undocumented people who can't then reapply, can't apply for admission is also wrong in my mind. The final point is that we need a new intergenerational bargain between immigrants, boomers, and millennials. We need to have free college. We need to have access to healthcare for everybody as if it was a human right, the way most of the industrialized world does. We need to invest in infrastructure and social institutions that promote integration, mobility, and justice, that promote a fair seat at the table for everybody. And it's not rocket science. We've done this before. It's not always been smooth, but we've done it. The post-war boom after World War II didn't happen because the government sat back and said, okay, you guys just do it all yourselves, right? We had the GI Bill, free college, subsidized mortgages, all those things. We could do something like that now in this crisis. And I think Biden is planning to use the crisis widely. I've been very pleased with how ambitious his agenda is. If he gets half of it done, It'll be awesome. So, all right, I took more than 40 seconds, but thank you for your indulgence, and I will yield the floor. Thank
But I
you.
understand that also to be the initial speech in your 2024 campaign. So we appreciate the preview.
What am I running for?
To be determined, but we'll come up with that later. Thank you for all of that, Carla. Going back to the trade issues and thinking about our trade agreements, to what extent do you see that becoming a major agenda item in a Biden administration? And I'm going to go to David in a little while to talk about questions about restoring American credibility generally in the diplomatic community, but with regard specifically to trade and its impact on the ability to really boost economic productivity and inclusion in the United States. Can you talk a little bit about the facts and the political realities the Biden administration will face?
Profoundly, deeply, agonizingly ambivalent. And particularly because they want to do all the things that Rob said. And the politics of that is, as much as it is wrong, people see this as a zero-sum game. The more migrants you bring in, the less people want to expand, into global trade. People think about taking jobs. And in reality, some of these trade deals have taken jobs. So there is profound ambivalence that's there, not just as the zero sum of for racist reasons, but the labor movement itself, including the white labor movement, this is, and not just the white labor movement, but the entire labor movement. People see this as a zero sum game. That's the one side, okay? There's that profound ambivalence. And if you're going to have that large an agenda on migration, it's going to make it hard to expand on global trade politically. They won Pennsylvania, but barely. These are places that they have to worry about, and they have to worry about keeping it, including 2 years from now on the ground. So the politics of that is very hard. At the same time, they are looking out into the world there, and they want to rebuild their alliances, and they see what's happening, particularly with China. I mean, the EU, Biden is very committed to the notion that we are supposed to confront the Chinese for all the bad things that they do with our allies. So what did the EU just do? The EU signed a trade deal with the Chinese. Even though the Biden team did something pretty extraordinary during a transition, which is they warned the EU not to do it, and the EU went ahead anyway. So we're out in the cold. I mean, there's RCEP, which without the United States and with the Chinese in it, we are out in the cold on a lot of things there. So they are going to have to figure out how to balance the politics of this, dealing with migration, doing the right thing there, not getting left out, how to deal with the Chinese themselves, and the fact of the matter that everybody else in the world is signing trade deals, and we are being left out in the cold. And the domestic politics of that versus the global reality is a very, very hard thing to deal with, and don't expect them to deal with it anytime soon. Just too hard politically.
Thank you. David, let me turn to you on the broader environment in which those trade deals and other diplomatic initiatives will take place. We have suffered catastrophic declines in trust among many nations just based on popular polls, but also among policy elites as the coin of American trust and credibility has been greatly debased over the course of at least these last 4 years, if not a longer period of time. Can you talk a little bit about how you expect to see the Biden administration deliver on its promise to restore American credibility and recommit to its alliances?
Sure. So I think the first thing I'd say here is that it's often easier to destroy a reputation than it is to rebuild one. And that's going to present a real challenge for the Biden administration, because our allies and our partners aren't just thinking about the next 4 years, they're thinking beyond that. And to the extent that bipartisan consensus has broken down on a lot of these foreign policy issues, that presents a real problem for anyone that wants to enter into an agreement or an understanding with us, because they don't know if that will last, which is certainly something that we saw with the Trump administration sort of reversing course on so many of these policies. So I think, you know, Joe Biden is well positioned in many ways as someone who has been active in American foreign policy for considerably longer than I have been alive. And, you know, that positions him with the relationships.
Nice, okay.
I think that is a nice thing. I think that positions him with the relationships and with the know-how to work on those relationships and to make some progress forward. But I think our allies and partners are going to be looking for signs of real commitment. And I think they're going to be looking for more than just words. And I think sort of the first test case we're going to see on all of this is Iran. The Iranians have sort of deliberately presented the Biden administration with a choice that needs to be made fairly early about the direction they're going to head on Iran policy. And our European allies certainly have a preference, which aligns with President-elect Biden's preference to return to something more like the Obama administration policy, but it's not clear if that deal is even still on the table. And so I think the way that crisis is managed and whether or not that's done in consultation with allies or that's done unilaterally is going to be a big break point. Very quickly, I want to say sort of the second aspect of this is on the personnel side, right? We've seen a gutting out of the sort of middle levels and the upper levels of the career service. And you know, actually in his confirmation hearing today, Secretary-designate Blinken said this was his #1 priority, was to rebuild the Foreign Service. But with those positions cleared out in a meaningful way, it's going to be hard to turn a ship immediately, and there's a need for some lead time.
Thank you. Let me focus on one region in particular and bring Desmond into the conversation. Desmond, Joe Biden has had closer relationships than most recently elected presidents with other governments in the hemisphere. We have a burgeoning crisis with regard to coronavirus, certainly in Mexico and Brazil, but in other nations as well. Do you expect to see greater attention to the hemisphere in a Biden administration? And if so, what form do you expect that to take? You're on mute.
I wouldn't say that Trump didn't pay attention to the hemisphere. The Trump administration did a number of things in the hemisphere. You know, I mean, they were famously renegotiated the North American Free Trade Agreement. You know, they've been involved in removing anti-corruption investigations against the Guatemalan government. They have adopted strategies to destabilize Venezuela that were unsuccessful, and they have an alliance with a populist right-wing government in Brazil. So, I mean, I think he's actually focused on the region. The Trump administration focused on the region a fair amount. I expect significant changes in the region, in policy towards the region in the coming years. So, I mean, to complement Rob's discussion of migration, right? One of the major planks of Biden's migration policy is increasing aid to Central America, especially Northern Central America, which is a region beset with drug violence, poverty, government corruption, to help build economies and to address rule of law issues, so that to decrease push factors promoting migration into the United States. So Biden wants a more orderly migration dynamic into the United States, and a pathway to citizenship once migrants are in the United States. In Colombia, Trump has adopted a very sort of vigorous anti-narcotics policy. Threatening Colombia with decertification, I believe, back in 2019, and then Colombia agreeing to standards for coca crop eradication that were pretty unrealistic. Biden, who has long contact with the country and supported Plan Colombia when he was in the Senate, is likely to pursue a more multi-vectored, more nuanced policy on drug issues in that country, and supporting the country as it seeks to the extent possible at this point, implement the Havana Accords and keep the conflict in that country under control after the FARC, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, demobilized and entered into peace with the government in 2016 and 2017. That was somewhat sabotaged by a right-wing government in Colombia. So Biden will likely try and support standing that up, I believe. Trump has had a pretty confrontational policy with the government in Venezuela. The Biden administration's likely to adopt a policy that seeks a more negotiated solution, certainly one that is less likely to threaten war, as the Trump administration did at various moments. Brazil has this right-wing populist government led by Jair Bolsonaro. Biden's been critical of his policies on the environment. There's likely to be less sympathy in Washington for the Bolsonaro government. Although there is a general commitment, I believe, in the hemisphere on the part of the Biden administration to greater free trade, which is something that the Trump administration had been hostile to. We're likely to see also constructive change on Cuba with a ratcheting down of tensions and an effort to reinitiate some of the policies of the Obama administration. And finally, I guess one of the big questions in the region is Mexico, which has had a kind of interesting set of dynamics with Trump. Trump has actually had a relatively positive relationship with Andres Manuel López Obrador, AMLO. The Trump administration has kind of been hands off. López Obrador is seen as kind of a left-wing populist, so it's a different dynamic there. There is, the possibility of a bit more tension between López Obrador and Biden than there was between López Obrador and Trump, where there was this kind of mutual accommodation. And that relationship with Mexico is really critical in terms of migration, in terms of counter narcotics policy, in terms of sort of rule of law and stability, both in the Mexican states and in Northern Central America, and in terms of U.S. trade. I mean, Mexico is a critical trading partner for the United States, and of course they're involved in the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Trade Agreement, the USMCA, as it was renamed under the Trump administration. And so Mexican policy is likely to be very interesting also in the coming years.
Sounds like a lot more activity that we can expect, and perhaps some of it in the fairly near term. I'd like to pick up on one aspect of the tension with the likely to emerge with the Bolsonaro government and the Biden administration, and that has to do, and I mean no pun, the hot button issue being, although we have a growing list of issues, but is burning of the Amazonian rainforest, and that relates to climate change. And Mitch, I wonder if we could get your voice in here. What do you expect to be, the Biden administration has said that it will rejoin the Paris Climate Accords. What do you think the near-term, both politics and practical likelihood of rejoining those accords will be with regard to everything else that we've been talking about here on the policy plate?
Yeah, well, it's very clear that the Biden administration is taking a proactive position. The appointment of John Kerry as our global ambassador. They're bringing Gina McCarthy back, the former head of the EPA, to be the domestic climate czar. So I think it's quite clear that he does take this seriously. He gets it. He spoke extensively during the campaign about green jobs and how, this wasn't just a feel-good liberal issue, but something that will play an important role in rebuilding the economy. So I think you will see a very serious attention to it. Now, we have a lot of work to do ourselves in terms of meeting our commitments under the existing Paris Climate Agreement. We're not where we need to be. On the other hand, you're seeing extensive investment now, not just by Tesla, but by virtually every automobile company in the world. So we're going to see a major acceleration of a move to all electric fleets or largely electric fleets. And of course, there are all sorts of other technologies coming down the line, the improvements in battery technology, et cetera. Now, all that's to the good. You mentioned the Amazon. That's a very serious and continuing problem. Bolsonaro talks the talk, but he doesn't walk the walk in terms of addressing what's going on in the Amazon. And there's been lots of photos published of the the destruction of the rainforest. I think what's needed there, by the way, is that the world is going to have to compensate Brazil for not developing the rainforest. And that's not something that we've ever seriously addressed. Maybe I should just leave it there.
Thank you. Let me ask a general question about, and this, please feel free, I'm going to call on two of you, but I'd like to hear from more voices on this one. What are you going to be looking for as you gauge the Biden administration's success? I mean, obviously, it's relatively easy at one level with COVID vaccination rollout. We'll know who does or doesn't get shots and what the total numbers are and how well it's distributed regionally. But in other areas, are you going to be looking at things? I mean, right now, obviously, we don't have an administration. We won't until tomorrow afternoon. But we've got cabinet appointments. Hector and Carla, you were talking about, and Carla, I know right now you're writing about cabinet appointments. There's an early indicator. Could you talk about those? And while they're doing that, the rest of you, what are you going to be looking at to say, yeah, they're on track, or no, they're falling off track and it's not happening the way I thought? Hector and Carla.
Listen, the number one thing for me is, and the biggest challenge that faces Biden is building domestic credibility and unity, which is not really in his control. And I mean, I think Democrats voted for him precisely because they get that this is a transcendent problem in this country. Even the notion that there are polls coming out even today that show that 70% of Republicans don't believe that Biden was legitimately elected. I mean, we have a profound problem in this country with that. How you govern under those conditions is, that's the biggest challenge that exists out there. Now, I just got a news alert from the Wall Street Journal saying that McConnell is blamed today by name the president for the events on the Capitol last week. That's a big step. That is a big step. Now, does that mean that Mitch McConnell is finally going to allow some governing to take place after 4 years? Or one could say maybe he didn't allow it at all during the Obama years either. But there is a profound challenge there. He brings more than anything else, how he governs to deal with the problems that exist out there. If you genuinely, that huge percentage of Republicans don't believe he's a legitimate president, that to me that's the fundamental notion of success or failure, not only for a Biden presidency, but for this country moving forward.
And there are many dimensions of this. Let me acknowledge that this parallels a question posted to chat by Howard Wong about disinformation and how we battle disinformation. These are all tightly connected to one another. Let me bracket that there are a bunch of ways to slice and dice this, but there are the tensions within the Democratic Party on the left wing of the party and the more centrist wing of the party, but also then moving beyond the party toward people who are much more vigorously opposed to and getting news from different sources that lend to an oppositional politics that are not predicated on the same set of facts. So some facts that we can look at are cabinet appointments. And thinking of the within party dimensions, Hector, how well is Biden doing in your view to satisfy the left wing of the party while maintaining his kind of centrist thrust in terms of the policy agenda vis-a-vis the cabinet appointments we've seen thus far?
This centrist thrust, an interesting issue. I know there's several here, I'm sure in the audience, that have studied political science, and my sense is that historically we've thought of the ideological distribution in the U.S. as approaching a normal distribution, and the small extremes and the middle is what we fight for, the kind of median voter model and all of that. And now we appear to be in a bimodal world where if you design policy to appeal to the two people in the middle, everyone is going to be very unhappy, and that's not anyone's definition of success. So we need to think about the implications of the polarization that Carla just pointed to, that seems to appear in every single survey that you take about every possible issue. The party ID or support for Trump, whether you're yes or no on that, seems to lead to really big differences with the rest. And again, those groups vary in size. If you're talking about 70 million people that are thinking very differently than the next 70 million people, that's going to be a really big governance, legitimacy, credibility challenge. And I think we underestimate how difficult from a practical doing and from a communications perspective, it's going to be to manage through that and begin to undo it. Certainly, variables like race, ethnicity, gender, age are broad categories that matter and that we typically use. On the race and ethnicity side, we tend to kind of count cabinet appointments, and the Brookings Institute did an analysis of at least the first 15 appointments in the Biden administration, and appointments tended to Reagan, Trump, and H.W. Bush were the high point, with about 80% of their appointments classified as white, non-Hispanic white, that is. And Clinton, W. Bush, Obama, and Biden all tracking around the 60% white. So 40% are non-white, but there's some differences. Clinton had more African Americans in his cabinet, certainly, than Hispanics. Hispanics were about 10%. Biden has now about 20% of the cabinet is of Hispanic origin. 3 of the 15 that were examined by Brookings, and slightly lower proportion of African Americans, 1 Native American appointment, and no Asian appointment. So for those that I mean, representation matters, and it's important to have it. So there's some work to be done at the top level. Now at the next level, there appears to be a significantly more representation of groups and communities of color. It varies. Their African American representation is significantly higher than the Hispanic representation, and the Asian Native American representation tracking significantly lower. So there's work to do on the quote unquote building a cabinet that reflects the country, which I think it's a valuable goal to aspire to.
As we, and I want to get more indicators of success here, but let's stay on this topic about building credibility across a very polarized population at this stage. Are there policies, and I think you're right, Carla, on the one hand, that this is not something Biden can do by himself, but at the same time, some of these policies and the way that they're presented, and we think about, he has said that he's not for a Green New Deal, but he is for a lot of new green and ecologically focused jobs. Will the success of selling that in communities that had hitherto been predicated on extractive industries, for example, be one of the ways that he establishes credibility in that arena?
Listen, I think competence is really credibility at this point. And dealing with COVID is going to be the absolute essential first step here. And he's certainly framing it, because even if you think about people who have different realities here, I mean, there haven't even been shared facts on COVID. I mean, Trump has denied the mortality numbers. And so if you see the candles that are being lit right now to say, look, 400,000 people have died, I mean, he's setting basic numbers and facts here. And so if we can get to the beginning in which everybody at least has shared definitions and facts, that will be a first step toward, and so I think that this is a very long process. Now, can you do it if everybody's just watching, if the quote unquote, the other side is just watching Fox News and One American Network? I don't know. And as a journalist, I can say that it terrifies me. But I think competence is really what it comes down to. And I will give him huge credit for staying on message so far. Here are the facts. I'm not going to lie to you. I'm going to try and unify. I mean, so far he's been very, very moderate. And for the Joe Biden whom I covered for years, David Lindsey, long before you were born, the Joe Biden I covered for years, was a guy who could never stop talking. And so far he has exercised an extraordinary amount of self-restraint and stayed on message. So God willing, he will continue to do that as well.
I think the cue here is Patria, Rob, and Mitch, if I saw the hands coming up at the right order. And then Mike. Patria? You're muted.
Says go to Mitch.
Yeah, why don't we, Rob, then Mitch, then Mike, and Patria, we'll loop back to you. Rob?
So I think Carla's point about competence creating, legitimizing his reputation, I think that will make a big difference in terms of this parallel epistemic reality with like half the people in the country not believing the election was real or that COVID is real. But, and this should not be a first 100 days thing, Biden needs to take steps to address the epistemic crisis in the country. And I don't know if that means regulating social media platforms, which are creating definitive beliefs. I mean, you people have read this stuff, right? There are nurses who won't take the shot, or people who are dying and doctors are intubating them so they can breathe, saying it's not COVID. I don't understand. It's hard for me to understand this, but I think this epistemic reality it's an existential threat to the country, and it's a thing that does need to be addressed. Carla's instinct, I think, is spot on in saying, let's just vaccinate a lot of people, get the economy moving, and make things better, and then that will move the dime a little bit. But I really think there needs to be other issues, because the structure that creates that, the informational ecosystem that has allowed this to happen, it still is there. We're still fighting within the same set of rules and structures.
Well, I didn't say just vaccinate, Rob. I also said that what we are going to have is a different bully pulpit. We have a president who one hopes will stay on message here. And it is, so far it has been a very fact-based message. And that is a huge, huge relief from what we've seen. But if Fox News doesn't carry it, that becomes a huge challenge. And if everybody ends up going to, if it's not Parler, if everybody ends up going to Signal or some Tor or dark web to get their information, it becomes a huge challenge.
Maybe even harder than when they're in something visible, but we'll see how that evolves. Patria has her mic up again.
I am sorry about that. I don't know what happened. So I think that if going back to, for me, one of the things that was very alarming, and for a lot of us who do performance measurement, was the taking out of the budget circulations part 6, which makes performance report and accountability and efficiency in government very visible to people. And so I am very excited to see someone appointed for OMB. I think his name is Sim Miller. He was a past Obama official, and what he's going to be doing is basically bringing back a real performance management agenda back for Biden. He was a former operative during the Obama administration. And I hope that the circular 811, which is the one where you're submitting budget requests, especially after we worked so hard to have the government performance and accountability, GEPRA, and then the GEPRAMA in 2010 that was reapproved. They just took it completely out in this last iteration. So now I'm hoping that that's going to be back in. We are really going to be focusing on performance and accountability and on evidence-based management, which was part of the Obama performance, presidential performance agenda, the government performance agenda. So that's going to be success for me, in addition to what my other colleagues have said. And also, if there is a focus on legislation that is going to start regulating social media. And I am not saying that I am against, please don't read that, against first our rights to free speech. However, I am against the right to hateful speech and things of that sort. So I think that our legislation is too far behind and we need to move on this. It's not going to happen during the first 100 days because it's just not possible, but we need to see that's going to be success if we start making progress toward that.
It's an interesting point, and Tom Edsel had a very interesting piece in the Times, I believe it was 2 weeks ago, speculating on the death of the First Amendment in the face of the disinformation challenges, but we'll get back there in a while. Mitch.
Yeah, just two very quick points. I align myself with all the comments of Carla's remarks and others about how to counter the big lie that's still out there. I think this is going to require, in addition to a very positive, proactive effort by the Biden administration, there may need to be some extraordinary efforts. For example, in bringing in the ad council to do a series of public spots that just lay out the facts of the election. Of course, that would be unprecedented to use them in that fashion, but this lie is going to be propagated over and over again in the coming months, not only by the outgoing president, but by all of his supplicants and enablers. Second and separate point, you may have seen the article a couple of weeks ago by Tom Friedman proposing that Kamala Harris be appointed as a czar basically for interior development, that she could be focused on the needs of the hinterlands, of the interior, the places that seem to breed the support for the MAGA arguments. People in towns that feel like they've been passed by, where industry has left, et cetera. I think there's some actual significant merit in that idea because somehow these folks have to be convinced that the government does care about them, does understand their pain, and is doing something about it.
And that is a major challenge indeed, given the media fragmentation that we alluded to earlier, but a necessary task. Mike.
Yes.
And by the way, I just posted to chat the Edsel article for those who are interested.
Yeah. One selfish thing and one big picture and fundamental issue. Support to the governments as they confront the lost revenues related to COVID. Port Authority, for example, lost $3 billion in construction capacity due to the revenue declines at the airport and PATH. With that $3 billion, we're looking at completing the Terminal 1 project, LaGuardia Airport renewal, AirTrain, Newark AirTrain, LaGuardia, and a host of other things, restoring the George, all vitally important to the region. You know, our infrastructure generates approximately 15% of the US GDP. And that's significant and noteworthy, and hopefully that'll be addressed. And more fundamentally, it speaks to our democracy. It speaks to the issues that underlie what happened this summer, and that's John Lewis's Voting Rights Act. That can be done in 100 days. That could be done in 10 days, given the importance of it, the comprehensiveness of it. It's the underpinning of our democracy. A suppression of anyone is a defeat of democracy, and we need to get behind that full-heartedly.
That is an inspiring marker, Mike. Where do you predict the politics, given the absolutely manifest interest on the part of the Republican Party, certainly at the state level, but arguably at the national level as well, in restricting the vote and ensuring, in their language, election integrity, rather than in trying to ensure the franchise? Where do you see that going?
Well, I'm not a politician or study it in depth, but there are some Republican Congress people from Maine, from Utah, from Alaska, and a few other places that might be willing to join in on such a fundamental matter. So hopefully, given the capabilities of our new president, in terms of coalition building, this could be something that a good portion of the Republican Party can rally around.
That would go a long way toward establishing that credibility and trying to rebuild the civic infrastructure of the nation. Let me ask before I'm prepared to go to questions from the audience. We have a growing list, a veritable shower of questions, all of them good, and thanks to many of the panelists for responding in the chat thread. But I want to elevate some of them to our broader conversation. Does anybody have any additional indicators though that you're going to be paying attention to in these next 100 days? Which brings us right to May 1. Patrick.
I have also the thinking Biden write an executive order that basically gets rid of Trump's executive order for Schedule F. We're basically turning federal employees into what is called at will, which I think is a terrible idea because you can get kicked out basically, and it brings back the opportunity for cronyism, which then we just saw that they just appointed, was it Miller to NASA in a civil service job. And this is basically a this is a cronyism. And it would basically get rid of our civil service system, which we've had since 1883. And so I would be looking for Biden to immediately rescind that executive order. Though it's going to be a nightmare because I'm sure they've already started to transfer people from the civil service to just appointed jobs.
Yes, and that the deadline for that is actually this very day.
Exactly.
And it's entirely possible that by the end of the afternoon, we will see 100,000 heretofore civil servants lose their job. They would, of course, be swiftly reinstated tomorrow, but that mechanism would be ugly to contemplate. Thank you. David, I saw you had your hand up too.
Yeah, I mean, I think other indicators to look at are the progress of confirmations, and not just for the cabinet people, right? Are they actually staffing the sub-cabinet? Because that's a good indication of if you're really making progress rather than just installing those top people that get all the press attention. So I think that's certainly something to look at. And then also on the diplomatic front, is Biden scheduling foreign travel? Is he hosting visitors? And is the promised summit of democracies coming together, or is he sort of stuck at home confronting COVID, just like everyone else in quarantine? So is there that kind of activity picking back up, or are we not seeing that yet?
Okay, thank you. Well, let me go to questions from the audience, if I may. And I'm going to go back to the beginning. We've talked about some of these questions, or some of them have been well answered in chat. So I'm going to deal with the items that have received less attention. Hafsa Tahir has a question for anyone, although I think, Rob, we might start with you. The question is related to DACA and legalizing immigrants with tricky legal statuses. How does this issue get resolved with a 50-50 Senate?
That is the $64 million question. I mean, one thing will depend on whether or not they continue to honor the filibuster. In an important sense, I feel like we have one party that tries to follow rules and the other party that games rules. And basically the rules, like the deficit's really important when Democrats are in power, but it's not. And like when the Republicans are in the minority, the filibuster is really important. And when they're in the majority, it's not. So I think that's a first question. On a slightly more optimistic note, there's a lot of support for immigration reform. Broad majorities of Americans of all parties favor legalizing dreamers. And I think, I mean, look, Biden has been, as David has repeatedly mentioned already, Biden has been around the block a few times, and I think he will know how to thread this needle as best he can. I'm hoping that a lot of moderate, I would even say non-Trump conservatives and Republicans in the Congress and the Senate will go along with it. And I think it's an overwhelmingly popular cause. So, and I think it's a moral cause. We're on the wrong side of history. We've been on the wrong side of history for 11 million people's worth and 5 million children's worth. I think it's a time for America to get back on the right side. So yeah, we can go on more, but I think it will get done in some form. I think the first step, I saw a comment by Dick Durbin today, they're going to do a legalization for essential workers. So they're very smartly going to tie the immediate COVID crisis and the enlightened self-interest, not enlightened, but the self-interest of people like us getting our groceries delivered to the supply chain and to the status of the undocumented people doing a lot of that work.
The
Yes,
challenge
say,
question with immigration changes will be two. One, whether they adopt a retail approach versus a wholesale approach. Everyone recognizes that doing the most sympathetic first means that the least sympathetic have a harder and harder chance of getting done because they're left out on their own, essentially. Whereas comprehensiveness brings sort of everyone in the same, together in the same bill. So how Biden plays that I think will be interesting. And second, we hope that the lessons from the Obama administration were learned. Certainly throughout the entire Obama administration, there was a very cautious approach to immigration policy. The first term, advocates were basically told, wait till the second term, because if we do this now, we won't get reelected. And when the second term came, the Republicans had a majority and they were able to stop and squash everything. And things like DACA were done because Marco Rubio threatened to do it first. And essentially it was going to be a political coup on the Obama administration. So I hope they learn those lessons, and this time around they take a more proactive approach, because we saw the consequences with the Trump administration, and the pendulum, I think, swung way too much in the opposite direction. I think you're right that most people right now are adopting a more sensible approach. And if there's one thing we know, is that the best antidote to undocumented immigration is documented immigration. And if we can open the door of documented immigration a lot broader, we'll have less undocumented immigration and less of those kinds of challenges to deal with. We produce a lot of our own documented immigration by the insanity of our immigration policy. And I get a sense that many folks get that now, and that unfortunately we had to go through the kind of 4 years of the Trump administration to learn that lesson the really hard way. I don't think Joe Biden wants to rebuild a deportation machine or compete with either Trump or Obama on who can deport more people. So there is an opportunity there. I hope it can be taken advantage of. And lastly, the minimum wage would be interesting to see how that one plays politically. It is also relatively popular with broad constituencies that are constituencies of interest to both Republicans and Democrats. So if that goes through smoothly, it may give an indication. If it becomes very contested, it'll send the opposite signal.
Thank you.
If I could, yeah, just add something here. I think that, yes, I do want to see a very, I want to use the word aggressive agenda, like really going for it. But I will have to say for immigration, one of the things that worries me, however, is to see, for example, there was a Guatemalan caravan that was coming into the United States. And unfortunately, when people see that, they become really entrenched and they become scared. You know, they get scared. These people are coming for us. They're going to take our jobs. So what I really wish is that the immigration activists and both on this side of the border and on the other side will really help to calm that down so that we can get something done. Because the more that people perceive that they are breaking the laws and they're coming here to take our places and to do the kind of things that basically Trump said, the more difficult it's going to be. We do have some goodwill built up, I think, right now, based on all the terrible things that were done to children separation, the cages that were used and everything. But those kind of news are going to affect how much can be done.
Thank you. Desmond, did I see a hand up on your end? Did you want to get into this? No, okay. We have a question from Gail Fitzer who asks, what do you recommend in terms of democratic reforms or legislation to prevent any future president from abusing their power, threatening our democracy, and trying to overturn the results of a free and fair election as Trump has? And what do you think the prospects are for HR 1, which is, of course, the bill on election integrity? Thoughts, what should we do? And if we take a sort of Levitsky and Ziblatt approach, there's not much we can do, that it's more about our norms than our statutes. But anything we could do statutorily, lots we could do on election integrity, although many of us were very favorably impressed by how well the admittedly extremely wonky machinery held up this last fall.
But David, if I may say, one of the things that worries me is that at the local level, they're gonna now go back and try to, through gerrymandering, I mean, that has to be addressed. Unless we address gerrymandering, we're gonna continue to have these extreme views that have come to Congress. And so I think that that is gonna have to be addressed if we want to make sure that we continue to have a democratic democracy and that we have an electoral system that really doesn't stop people from voting and from exercising their rights. So I think there's a lot of work to be done on that, and I hope to see that the courts will be taking up gerrymandering that is going on.
Good luck with that until somewhere in the third quarter of the 21st century, I'm afraid. Desmond, for the court.
So I'd just like to follow up on that and go back to the question raised earlier about a new Voting Rights Act. I think that this is really essential looking forward, and there has to be a comprehensive and forward-looking Voting Rights Act. And I would say that this has to be dealt with very early so that there can be constitutional challenges to it addressed while Democrats still hold control of Congress. And that may be impossible, and the Supreme Court may avoid actually pronouncing on any new Voting Rights Act until after Democrats lose power. Because if you think back to some of the decisions that led to the current situation, a lot of them were made by the Supreme Court after Democrats lost control of Congress. And some of them were, decisions that basically said Congress got it wrong and they can go back and fix it. Republicans have simply been reluctant to fix it. And I think, if anything, the last election provides a great deal of evidence that the laws governing our elections have been stressed a great deal by this, and that we need a new framework to maintain order in that process.
David.
Yeah, so I want to pick up on a different angle of that question, which is the abuse of power issue, which I think ties into these broader questions of executive power. And if we look at most of the things that people are concerned about that happened in this administration, they were done with executive powers rather than legislatively. So I think there's an opportunity here, although it's a tightrope, for the Biden administration to accede to sort of giving up some executive power by signing legislation that will have that effect, and that there might be sort of an institutional interest in opposing, but perhaps setting that aside in the interest of the future. I think a high impact thing that can happen pretty rapidly is a statute to clarify congressional subpoena power and the consequences of defying a congressional subpoena. I think other sort of good governance reform like that, strengthening the Freedom of Information Act, things like that could really pay dividends. And I think Biden is in a unique position to set aside the interests of his office in favor of sort of doing what's right there.
And it could well be, now that the Republicans have lost the majority in the Senate, that they will be much more susceptible to trying to reestablish the subpoena power of the Congress.
Precisely, yeah.
Yeah.
The good part of this is also norms and reasserting norms and drawing the attention to it, because we took so much of this for granted. I think one of the lessons of Trump more transcendently was we thought he would be constrained by the institutions because we didn't spend a lot of time thinking about the fragility or the brittleness of the institutions. And I think the transcendent lesson, and on the question of subpoena, if you think about how often the Trump administration refused to send people to testify before a Republican-controlled Senate, okay? A friendly Senate. They didn't turn over documents to the Intelligence Committee. They didn't send people to testify before Armed Services. They didn't send people to testify before Senate Foreign Relations Committee. This became the default. You asked for people to give you information. You didn't give them information. So I think that a consciousness of reestablishing the norms and talking about institutions is a really, really important thing to happen. Yes, subpoena power would be really important, but how often, even if, how often does it really end up in the courts? I mean, how often are they going to throw anybody in chains if they defy it? Yes, that's really important, but I think that there has to be a really healthy conversation about the relationship between Article 1 and Article 2, and a really healthy conversation about what happened with Trump, about how much it wasn't just Trump and the tweets. The entire system almost broke. And we have to really have just a fundamental conversation in Washington, but throughout the country, about how close we came to the whole thing falling apart.
This relates closely to a question that Sam Wittenstein asked about prioritization. Does impeachment wind up eating the Biden agenda and delaying confirmations of cabinet appointees and others in the first 2, 3, 4 weeks of this administration, which would be disastrous? Or is there a way past that? How should they prioritize?
Biden has asked that they do 1 in the morning and 1 in the afternoon. I mean, that's what he's asked. And with Schumer in the Senate, I mean, it's interesting reading about whether the Senate is actually supposed to only do one thing. They're supposed to sit, and they're not going to like it one little bit. Nevertheless, I mean, that he's asked for them to do that. And I think originally he didn't want the impeachment to go ahead because he thought it was going to eat his entire agenda. But I think that they see that there is what was the term, an epistemic value? Is that what Rob said? I think that they see the value of, that there's something to be learned from this. And I think the Senate's going to work very hard to do it. He is in a situation already in which he's not, because they've delayed so much, he's not going to have a lot of people in place, including a defense secretary in place at the time he takes office. And when you consider what a fragile situation we are, including, I just once again saw a news alert saying that they've got two members of the National Guard who've been removed from the security detail because they have perceived relations, ties to right-wing groups. It would be really good to have a defense secretary in place at the time of it. So there's a lot of work that has to be done.
Thank you, Mitch.
Yeah, and the fact that there's only one article, I mean, I think that will certainly speed up the process. You look at how long the last trial took. There's every reason to believe they can complete this trial in days, 2 to 3 days at the most. So I think that's not a real issue.
And Rudy is not going to be in the defense team, so there's no drama.
It'll be less entertaining, but less drama.
But he's a witness, so there will be some drama, at least with the.
We'll hope for the shoe polish to run again. We'll see what happens at the appropriate time. Jonathan Alarcon has 4 questions. That's cheating, Jonathan. So I'm just going to take your first one. How does this administration deal with China? And Jonathan throws in a question about UFOs as well. So if you want to go there, that's a bonus round. But China, where do we go? Mitch.
Yeah, I addressed this in the chat room in response. I think we are likely to see a concerted effort to improve trade relations, which have become absolutely toxic, but much will depend on whether the Chinese are willing to demonstrate good faith by taking actual real steps to change their behavior with regard to theft of intellectual property and gaming the system. I'm more worried about the strategic implications. What they've done in the South China Sea, militarizing or attempting to militarize the South China Sea by building these artificial reefs. Well, they're real reefs, but they've built them up with runways and missile and battery emplacements, what I call permanently moored aircraft carriers. We cannot sacrifice the right of free passage in the South China Sea, not just we, but the rest of the Pacific trading nations. So there's a lot of changes that are going to happen, but clearly China is the rising hegemonic power, and they're not going to back off. So it's going to have to be a serious negotiation.
Anybody else want to add anything on China?
The role in the in this hemisphere is going to be interesting to watch under the Biden administration, given that it is increasing. And there's already been a couple of places where you've seen some changes. I also was very curious what Desmond and Carla thought about the exit bomb that the Trump administration left for the Biden administration on Cuba by declaring it a state sponsor of terrorism, which I think is designed to make it really difficult for Biden to undo. I think I completely agree with Desmond that the Venezuela policy, to some extent, is likely to be more stable in the sense, because Biden doesn't sound to be that much different from Trump vis-a-vis Venezuela, but there may have been some differences vis-a-vis Cuba. Do you think that that's something that they're going to deal with or address, the Cuba state terrorism issue?
Well, I mean, I guess on the Venezuela question is a little easier to answer. I don't think Biden wants Maduro around, but he's likely to be less confrontational in the effort to achieve that. I mean, Donald Trump has been frighteningly bellicose on Venezuela at times. On Cuba, I think that Trump is trying to make things difficult for Biden. I don't know how Biden exactly will respond to it, right? And this begins to get into the politics of Miami, the city where I'm from and grew up, which are notoriously complex in the context of the US. And I think you're going to see a more progressive agenda from Biden. I think you're probably going to see some rollbacks, but Biden, of course, in the context of Florida politics, has to be cautious about that. And Democrats have always had to be cautious about it. And that's why they have tended to move slowly. The other complication in terms of Cuba policy was the rollback of the reestablishment of the US embassy under the the dynamic of acts of violence being undertaken against US officials in the country, which have since been replicated in other places. And it's not immediately clear to me how the Biden administration, which I would think would want to get back there, at least on some level, certainly some of the same people in the Obama administration who supported that set of policies, are going to be back on board and interested in reestablishing something like that. It's not clear to me exactly how the Biden administration will move back towards that or what pace they will take on that. And I think Hector's really right to bring up this question of these kind of little bombs that Trump is setting up in foreign policy for Biden. Today, the Trump administration declared that China is carrying out crimes against humanity, against the Uyghurs, which I don't think is necessarily wrong. I think it's important to identify these types of abuses that are taking place. On the other hand, it does complicate Biden's hand in some important ways in terms of dealing with China. And the other area, which has me very worried in terms of the damage that the Trump administration has done to potential foreign policy on the part of the Biden administration, is Iran, where the Trump administration's policies on the agreement that the Obama administration have been incredibly destructive and have introduced a remarkable amount of instability going forward, not just in US-Iran relations, but in European-Iran relations.
I thank you very much for that. We are just about out of time. I know that David had wanted to get in here on that last question. So David, you have the last word.
All right then. Yeah, so on China, I mean, I think I agree very much with Mitch that this is the relationship that's going to define geopolitics in the years ahead. And so it's a big challenge for the Biden administration. And not only did the Trump administration's statement today say crimes against humanity by China against the Uyghurs, they actually said genocide and not acts of genocide or any such euphemism. So and setting up sanctions and so on and so forth. So I think this does present Biden with a complex position where walking these things back looks like sort of giving in, leaving them in place, looks like endorsing these sort of aggressive acts. And so there's a real challenge there, and there's a real tightrope to walk because no one wants out and out conflict with China. You've got to find a way to have a cooperative relationship. But I want to bring it back to allies. And I think that the key to dealing with China is to keep our allies on our side. And of course, the failure of TPP was the failure of the signature attempt of the last administration to do that. Trade policy seems like a less likely vehicle now, but there needs to be some attempt to reinvigorate those US alliances in the region with traditional partners.
Okay, thank you so much. We are going to leave it there. I want to ask everybody around the bezel to join me in thanking Michael Messiah, Patrick DeLancer-Julnes, Hector Cordero Guzman, Robert Smith, Desmond Arias, Carla Robbins, Mitchell Wallerstein, and David Lindsey for terrific insights covering a very broad range of material today. I'd like to thank as well Diana Lazoff for steering the boat today and keeping everything running smoothly on the Zoom lens here. And I'd like to thank all of you for your continued support of our Marks programming and our Baruch College programming overall around election 2020. That's now behind us. Everything that we'll be doing going forward is going to be looking at what we're actually accomplishing or not in 2021. Stay tuned. There will be a robust set of materials available and advertised through the normal channels very soon. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a safe and happy rest of January, and we'll all be tuned in to the inauguration tomorrow.
And thank you, David.
Thank you.